Welcome back. So today we're going to talk about sprint and Olympic distance triathlon race pacing. So the first thing you should know with race pacing is that it's extremely helpful to have established your functional threshold power, which would be your power setting on the bike. You can also do that for the run, and or your lactate threshold, your blood lactate threshold for heart rate. So knowing those numbers can really set you up for exact pacing strategies. And as a reminder, the way you would establish those is you could do a 30-ish minute time trial on the run and bike to figure that out. Whatever value you get as an average for that 30-minute section, multiply it by 0.98 or 98, 97%, somewhere in that range, to establish your threshold, which is approximately the power or threshold you could hold for 1 hour, right? So knowing those numbers, super helpful. You don't have to do it, but it really helps. So for an experienced, extremely fit athlete in a sprint, your goal is going to be to hold at and over your threshold, because you're going to be finishing a sprint in an hour plus or minus a little bit depending on the distance of the bike. And a really good strategy to go into that race is to ride for 3 or 4 minutes over threshold, not a ton over threshold, but up to the 105, 110% range, and then ride 2 or 3 minutes under threshold. So you're like 3 or 4 minutes over threshold, 1, 2, or 3 minutes under threshold. And not significantly under, but like in the 90 to 95% of your threshold, because you'll recover because your fitness is so deep, and that will get you through the race very fast. If you're a little more cautious, then you could hold right at your threshold number, and you should be fine fitness wise. And then on the run, you're going to be again right at threshold, maybe pushing over and then recovering under slightly. Again, a more conservative effort would be to just hold at or under threshold. That's for experienced athletes. For intermediate athlete, let's say you're pretty fit, but you're not training super hard, or you've only been in the sport a handful of years, you'll want to go into those races with the goal of holding just under your threshold numbers, meaning you're riding in the 95-ish percent, 90% of FTP, and you're going to run. Honestly, you should run as hard as you can and just slow down every time you need to. But you could run at, about 95% of your threshold heart rate, and you should be fine. For a newer athlete, let's say you don't have much race experience or it's your first real season, you might not even know your threshold numbers. So your effort level is going to be somewhere in the moderate to moderate hard. If you do know your threshold number, maybe you're in the 85 to 90% of your FTP, and something similar on the run with regard to lactate threshold. Moderate to moderate hard should get you through a sprint without undue difficulty, and you would carry that over to an Olympic distance race. So I'm going to start with the newer athletes in the Olympic distance. When you get to the longer Olympic distance, that's a 25-ish mile bike and a 10K run, as well as the swim. I'm not talking about the swim because I'm assuming you are fit enough to get through the swim without any problems. You're going to have to be a little more conservative here, because now we're talking about a longer period of time. It's going to be, for a new athlete, probably in the 2.5 at the faster level, and 3.5 hours for older athletes or slower athletes, which is totally fine. You just have to approach it that way. So now we're into maybe 80 to 85% of your FTP. This would be the zone 3-ish on the bike, and something similar on the run where you're at like a moderate to moderate hard intensity. If your lactate threshold was 160, you'll probably find it's difficult to go much under 150 because of the length of the event and the effort just to get there and hold a decent pace. If you're going to go significantly under lactate threshold on the run, you're going to be running kind of easy or moderate, or you're taking walk breaks. So somewhere in that moderate to moderate hard is your goal for newer athletes in an Olympic distance. but you're also going to have to worry about nutrition, hydration, and all those complications that go along with it. Stepping up to an intermediate level athlete, or intermediate experienced, here you got some room to wiggle with. So on the bike, you want to be in the 85 to 93-ish% of your FTP. 93 at the high end for an intermediate athlete. That's going to be zone 3 or zone 4. You're crossing over. And you could do the strategy where you push for a little bit and then you recover. Push for a little bit and recover. And then the same could be said for the run threshold. If your heart rate threshold is 160, you can try to push up to that number. You may find yourself, granted, a lot of these races are going to be hot, you may find yourself going over. So you're going to be doing like going over threshold, coming back under with like slower pace, and then going over again. So you're going to be having to moderate as you go along. Olympic distance is, a long event. Any way you slice it, it's going to be, just under 2 hours for the fittest amateur athletes. So it's a long day. So hydration, nutrition, all those things come into play. Experienced athletes, like top level training, you're hitting 15-20 hours a week, you're doing a lot of intervals, all that sort of stuff. So you should know your numbers. This is where you are going to be slicing and dicing at the top end. 95% to 100% of FTP on the bike. The fitter you are, the closer you can do that and still run, right? Because part of the issue with going close to threshold for an hour is that you are going to be getting pretty tired, right? Because you're at threshold, and threshold by definition is 1 hour of effort. So 95 is safer, 100% if you're really trying to push it. If you tapered well and you suspect that your number is actually higher than what you are currently using, then that could work. You can play the game of going over threshold and then recovering for bits, but I wouldn't do anything more than 4 or 5 minutes over threshold and then about 2 minutes of under threshold. And that could be like a 105 FTP and then come back down to 90 to 95 of FTP. On the run, again, if your heart rate threshold is 160, as an experienced athlete, you should be right up to that number, sort of in the first mile, and then you're going to just be managing fatigue as you go along. So your heart rate may be creeping up, and you're just going to have to manage that effort where you back off as need be. That's a game that you can play with pace as well. If you know your pace, for an example, let's say it's 7-minute pace, that's your threshold pace. As close as possible to that pace without blowing up. If you pop, right, hitting the wall, just heart rate skyrockets. Now it's at 170, 175, and you're having trouble breathing, you're going to have to back off significantly. So it's better to back off a little bit earlier on than it is to push yourself to popping and then having to really recover, because then your pace is going to go to 8:30, 9 minute and stuff like that. So you don't want to hit that point. So, summary. For sprints, experienced athletes, really fit athletes, right at and over threshold. Intermediate athletes should be slightly under threshold, and newer athletes want to be a good bit under threshold. Olympic distance race, super fit, experienced, right at threshold as much as possible. Intermediate athletes into the 90 to 95% functional threshold power, and newer athletes 80-ish, 85% at the top end of your thresholds. That's all I can think of. Hope that helped.